Welcome back. This is part 2 of our series on the Idra Rabba, the Greater Assembly. In part 1, we set the stage. We talked about what the Idra is. We talked about the 10 companions gathering on the threshing floor. We talked about the oath, the weeping, the danger. We talked about 3 men dying from the sheer intensity of the light being revealed. All of that was the doorway. Now we walk through it. Because today we are going into the heart of what was actually taught on that threshing floor. Today we begin with the highest, most concealed, most transcendent configuration in all of Kabbalah. We are talking about Atika Kadisha, the Holy Ancient One, also known as Atik Yomin, the Ancient of Days. This is the aspect of the divine that sits above everything else, above the Sephirot as we normally understand them, above the tree of life as it is normally drawn. This is the root of the root, the concealment behind all concealments. And the Idra Rabba is the first place in the entire Zoharic literature where this configuration is described in full anatomical detail. So what I want to do in this episode is walk you through the 4 primary structures of Atika Kadisha as the Idra reveals them. We are going to cover the Gulgalta, the skull, the Avirah, the concealed air or atmosphere, the Mocha, Stima'ah, the concealed brain, and the Tala, the dew of life. These 4 structures form the upper architecture of the Holy Ancient One, and everything else in the Idra, the forehead, the eyes, the nose, the beard. All of that rests upon this foundation. So if you want to understand what comes later in this series, you need to understand what we are covering today. This is the bedrock. Let's begin. First, a word about Atika Kadisha itself before we get into the individual structures. In the Kabbalistic system, when we talk about the 10 Sephirot, the very Sephirah, the highest one, is Keter, the crown. Keter sits above Chokmah and Binah, above all the lower Sephirot. It is the bridge between the infinite, the Ein Sof, and the world of emanation. Now, Atika Kadisha is the inner dimension of Keter. It is what Keter looks like from the inside. It is the most intimate, most hidden face of the divine crown. And the Zohar is very careful to distinguish Atika Kadisha from Zeir Anpin, the small face, which we will cover later in this series. Zeir Anpin is the configuration that governs the 6 lower Sephirot from Hesed to Yesod. It is the face of God that we interact with in prayer, in Torah, in the day-to-day spiritual life. But Atika Kadisha is something else entirely. The Zohar says that in Atika Kadisha, there is no left side, there is no judgment, there is no din. Everything is pure compassion. Everything is pure will. Everything is radzon, desire in its most primordial, most uncontaminated form. This is God before God decides to create. This is the will behind the will. And when the Idra begins to describe the anatomy of this ancient one, it starts at the very top. It starts with the skull, the Gulgalta. The skull of the ancient one. Now, just to remind you of what we said in part 1. When the Zohar describes body parts of the divine, it is not being literal. It is not saying God has a physical skull made of bone. What it is doing is using the human form as a map, a symbolic architecture to describe flows of spiritual energy that would otherwise be completely beyond our comprehension. The body is the code. So when the Idra says skull, it means a containing structure, a vessel of the highest order. The Zohar tells us that the Gulgalta of Atika Kadisha is white, pure, radiant, luminous white. And this whiteness is not just a color. In Kabbalistic symbolism, white represents pure hesed, pure loving kindness, pure mercy with no admixture of judgment whatsoever. The skull of the Ancient One shines with a light that has no boundary, no limit, no restriction. It radiates in all directions simultaneously. And the Zohar says that this white light is so intense, so overwhelming, that no created being can gaze upon it directly. Not the angels, not the seraphim, not even the highest souls. It is beyond perception. Now, here is the key teaching. The Gulgalta contains everything. Every blessing, every abundance, every flow of life force that will eventually cascade down through all the worlds. It all originates here, in this skull. The Zohar uses the language of 13,000 myriads of worlds that are sustained by this Gulgalta. 13,000 myriads. That number is not arbitrary. 13 connects to the 13 attributes of mercy, which we will explore in detail when we get to the beard, the Dikna, in part 3. But the point for now is this. The skull of the Ancient One is the ultimate reservoir. It is the source from which all compassion, all sustenance, all vitality flows into existence. And the Idra tells us that the Gulgalta expands. It is not static, it is alive. It pulsates, it radiates. The dew, which we will talk about shortly, drips from the skull continuously. It never stops. Day and night, the Gulgalta is nourishing everything beneath it. It is the fountain that never runs dry. Now, surrounding the Gulgalta is what the Zohar calls the Avirah, the concealed air. Sometimes it is translated as the concealed atmosphere or the concealed ether. And this is one of the most mysterious and least discussed elements in the entire Idra. The Avirah is a membrane of pure, transparent, concealed air that envelopes the skull of the Ancient One. Think of it as a field. an atmosphere, an envelope of stillness that surrounds the highest point of the divine. And the Zohar is emphatic. This Avirah is utterly hidden. It is concealed within concealment. It is the secrecy around the secret. No one can penetrate it. No one can grasp it. Even the word hidden does not do it justice, because hidden implies that something could potentially be found if you looked hard enough. The Avirah is beyond finding. It is the principle of concealment itself. So why does it matter? Why does the Idra even mention it? Because the Avirah teaches us something fundamental about the nature of the divine at its highest level. At the root of all reality, before anything is emanated, before any Sephirah comes into being, there is a space of absolute stillness, absolute quiet, absolute concealment. The Avirah is the womb before the birth. It is the silence before the word. It is the breath that has not yet become speech, and everything that follows, everything that exists, emerges from within this concealed atmosphere. The Arizal later developed this concept extensively. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the Avirah connects to what he calls the Tehiru, the primordial space that remains after the Zimzum contraction. But in the Idra itself, the language is simpler, more poetic, more primal. It is just this: there is an air around the holy ancient one that nobody can know. And from within that air, everything begins. Inside the Gulgalta, enclosed by the Avirah, sits the Mocha Stima'ah, the concealed brain. And if the Gulgalta is the vessel and the Avirah is the atmosphere, then the Mocha Stima'ah is the content. It is what the skull contains. It is the innermost wisdom of the Ancient One. Now, in the standard Kabbalistic framework, the brain corresponds to Chokmah, wisdom. Chokmah is the first flash of insight, the initial spark of knowing that precedes all elaboration. But the Mocha Stima'ah is not ordinary Chokmah. It is concealed Chokmah. It is wisdom before it becomes knowable. It is the thought of God before that thought takes any shape, any form, any direction. The Zohar says this brain is calm. It is tranquil. It is utterly still. It does not pulse with activity the way the lower Sephirot do. It simply is. It rests within itself in perfect equilibrium. And the Zohar makes a crucial distinction here. It says the Mocha Stima'ah radiates through 32 paths. Now, if you know your Sefer Yetzirah, the book of formation, you know that 32 is the number of the paths of wisdom. 22 Hebrew letters plus 10 Sephirot equals 32. These are the building blocks of creation, and the Idra is telling us that all 32 paths originate here, in this concealed brain. Before the letters exist as letters, before the Sefirot exists as Sefirot, they are all contained as potential within the Mocha Stima'ah. They are seeds that have not yet sprouted, blueprints that have not yet been built. This is why the concealed brain is so important. It is the origin point of all structure, all differentiation, all form. But it itself has no form. It is pure potential, pure possibility, and it only begins to express itself outwardly when its influence flows downward through the Tala, the dew. And that brings us to the Tala, the dew. This is where the teaching becomes deeply beautiful. The Zohar tells us that from the skull of the Ancient One, from the Gulgalta that contains the concealed brain, there drips a dew, a holy dew. And this dew is the sustenance of all life, in all worlds, at all times. Nothing exists without it. Nothing survives without it. Every soul, every angel, every blade of grass, every galaxy, all of it nourished by this dew that descends from the head of the Holy Ancient One. The Zohar calls this dew the dew of lights, Tala de Bedolcha, and it connects this dew to the manna that fell in the wilderness for the children of Israel. The manna was not just physical food, it was a manifestation, a lower world echo of this primordial dew. When the Israelites ate the manna, they were tasting, in diluted material form, the sustenance that flows eternally from Atika Kadisha. This is why the manna could taste like anything. This is why it satisfied every desire. Because at its root, it was sourced from the place where all desires are already fulfilled. And here is something remarkable that the Idra teaches. The Zohar says that in the future, in the time of the resurrection of the dead, it is this dew that will revive the dead. Not a miracle in the way we usually think of miracles, but a restoration of the original flow. When the Tala flows fully, without obstruction, without diminishment, the dead will rise. Life will return, because death itself is only possible when this dew is reduced, when the flow is blocked or diminished. At the level of Atika Kadisha, there is no death. There is only life. And the Tala is the mechanism by which that eternal life is transmitted downward into the worlds that experience finitude and mortality. The Zohar also tells us that this dew has two colors, or more precisely, two aspects. It is white, corresponding to pure Hesed, pure mercy, and it is also described as containing within it a reddish hue, a hint of Gevurah, of strength and structure, but so sublimated, so refined, that it doesn't function as judgment. It functions as the structuring principle within mercy, the form within the formless, the shape that allows the light to be received without shattering the vessels. And that is a direct callback to the Sefirat Hakelim, the shattering of the vessels that we discussed in part 1. The Tala is the repair. The Tala is how the light comes down gently enough that the vessels can hold it. So let us bring this all together. What we have covered today is the upper architecture of Atika Kadisha, the 4 foundational structures that everything else rests upon. The Gulgalta, the skull, is the containing vessel, the ultimate reservoir of white light and boundless compassion. The Avirah, the concealed air, is the atmosphere of absolute hiddenness that envelops the skulls, the silence before all sound. The Mocha Stima'ah, the concealed brain, is the pure potential within, the source of the 32 paths, wisdom before it becomes wisdom. And the Tala, the dew, is the mechanism of transmission, the flow of life from the concealed to the revealed, from the infinite to the finite, from the root to the branches. These 4 structures together describe something extraordinary. They describe how the most hidden, most transcendent aspect of God, the part that is beyond all knowing, nevertheless nourishes and sustains everything that exists. The whole point of this teaching is that concealment and revelation are not opposites. They are partners. The most hidden thing is also the most life-giving thing. The dew that sustains the universe flows from a brain that no one can perceive inside a skull that no one can look upon, surrounded by an air that no one can penetrate. And yet, here we are, alive, sustained, nourished, breathing. That is the miracle the Idra is pointing to. In part 3, we are going to tackle one of the most famous and most intricate sections of the entire Idra, the Dikna, the beard of the Ancient One. The 13 Tikkunei Dikna, the 13 configurations of the beard, which correspond directly to the 13 attributes of mercy. That teaching is going to connect everything we have learned here to the lived practice of prayer, teshuvah, and the high holy days. It is going to be a powerful episode. If you are new to this channel, I recommend going back to part 1 of this series and also checking out the Foundation series playlist. Those videos will give you the background you need to follow along. Thank you for showing up to learn these teachings. I will see you in part 3. Shalom.